The alarms on my bridge had not stopped screaming for 6 days. I am Vakar Thal, Fleet Commander of the Coalition 3rd Defense Line, and I had watched my formation shrink from 200 ships to 60 in less than a week. The enemy we called the Ashvale did not retreat. They did not negotiate. They simply kept coming, wave after wave, grinding down everything the free worlds had built over 3 centuries of peace. My hands trembled over the console as another ship on the tactical display blinked out of existence. That was the Renlar, a cruiser with 400 crew members, gone in a single breath. I did not even have time to learn the name of its captain before the display marked it as lost. "Commander, the Council is requesting an emergency channel," said my communications officer, a young Threll named Ossia. Her voice cracked with exhaustion. None of us had slept properly since the Ashvale broke through the outer colonies. I opened the channel, expecting more orders to hold a line that could not be held. Instead, the face of Elder Counselor Myras appeared, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear in the eyes of someone who had led our people for over 100 years. "Commander Thal," she said, her voice flat and controlled in the way that told me she was forcing herself not to shake. "The Council has voted. We are invoking the Old Pact." I did not understand at first. The Old Pact was ancient history, a footnote signed by our ancestors with a species so distant and so quiet that most of us had forgotten they existed. A species from a small blue world at the edge of known space, one that had never joined the Coalition, never sent ships to our councils, never asked for anything from us in 300 years. "You mean Earth," I said, and the word felt strange in my mouth. "I mean humanity," Myras corrected. "We are out of options, Commander. Our fleets are collapsing. 3 more systems fell in the last cycle. If we do not find help within days, the war is lost." I wanted to argue. Every instinct in my body told me this was a mistake. Humanity was young, unproven, barely a few centuries into space travel according to our own records. Their technology, what little we knew of it, was inconsistent, sometimes brilliant, and sometimes shockingly primitive. They fought each other more than they fought anyone else, according to the old reports. Asking them for help felt less like requesting aid and more like admitting defeat. But I said nothing of this to the counselor. I only nodded and closed the channel. Ossia looked at me from her station, her 4 eyes blinking in confusion. "Commander, do we actually believe they can help us, a species that has never fought a war beyond their own system?" "I do not know," I admitted, "but we no longer have the luxury of pride." The message was sent that night, carried by an old diplomatic relay buried deep in Coalition archives, a channel that had not been used since before I was born. I remember standing on the bridge, watching the transmission indicator blink for hours, wondering if anyone on the other end would even understand the signal, let alone respond to it. The response came faster than anyone expected. Barely 12 hours later, a message appeared on every Coalition channel, translated instantly into every known language, as if humanity had been ready for this exact moment for a very long time. There was no lengthy explanation, no request for details, no demand for payment or territory or anything at all, just a short line of text, delivered in a tone so calm it unsettled me more than any threat could have. Coordinates? I stared at that single word for a long time. Something about its simplicity felt wrong, like a held breath before a much larger sound. Around me, my crew murmured among themselves, some relieved, some doubtful, a few outright laughing at what they saw as an almost comically brief reply to a request for salvation. I was not laughing. I had spent enough years reading old reports on humanity, buried deep in Coalition intelligence archives, half-forgotten files that most officers never bothered to open. I remembered strange details from those files. Reports of human conflicts that ended not because one side ran out of will, but because one side ran out of people to send. Reports describing human industrial output during their own historical wars as something that outpaced entire star systems, all achieved with technology that, by our standards, should not have been capable of it. I remembered one line from an old Coalition analyst that I had never been able to forget. It said that humanity's greatest weapon was not their ships or their weapons, but their complete unwillingness to accept the idea that a war could not be won. I sent the coordinates myself, my hand steady this time, though I could not say exactly why. The council debated for another full day about what to expect. Some believed a token force would arrive, a handful of outdated ships meant only as a symbolic gesture, something to satisfy an old treaty without truly risking anything. Others believed humanity would refuse to engage at all once they saw the scale of the Ashvale assault, that they would turn back the moment they understood what they were being asked to face. I did not know what to believe. I only knew that our lines were failing, that every hour brought new losses, and that whatever answer arrived would decide whether the Coalition and everyone living within it would survive to see another season. On the 6th day since the message was sent, sensors across 3 systems detected something entering our space. No grand fleet banners, no diplomatic escort, no announcement beyond a single automated signal confirming their arrival. I remember Asia turning to me, her voice quiet. "Commander," she said, "they are here." I looked at the display, at the small cluster of unfamiliar signatures approaching the edge of our battle line, and felt something twist in my chest that I could not yet name. It was not quite hope. It was not quite dread. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of something none of us understood, waiting to see what humanity would become when finally given a reason to fight. I did not sleep that night. None of us did. We simply watched the display, waiting, wondering if the species we had once dismissed as too young and too small to matter was about to change everything we thought we knew about war. The human fleet arrived without ceremony, and that alone told me something was different about them. I had seen Coalition reinforcements arrive many times over the years, and every one of them followed the same pattern. Ships would emerge from transit in formation, running full power to their beacons, broadcasting identification signals long before they were even needed, announcing their presence to friend and enemy alike as if the arrival itself was meant to inspire courage in those who were watching. The humans did none of this. Their ships appeared on my sensors only moments before they dropped out of faster-than-light travel, engines running at what I can only describe as a whisper compared to the roaring signatures of Coalition vessels. No formation lights, no greeting broadcast, no display of numbers meant to reassure or intimidate. Just a quiet cluster of ships sliding into the edge of our system as if they were trying not to be noticed at all. "Commander," Asia said, her voice tight with confusion, "I am reading only 42 vessels." 42. I stared at the number on my display and felt a cold weight settle into my stomach. We had lost nearly 150 ships defending this line over the past week alone. 42 seemed less like reinforcement and more like an afterthought. Around the bridge, I heard quiet mutters of disbelief from my crew. A young weapons officer named Dross laughed under his breath, the kind of laugh that comes from exhaustion rather than humor. "This is what the old treaty promised us," he said. 42 ships against an enemy that has already crushed 3 of our fleets. I did not laugh. Something about the way those ships moved bothered me, though I could not yet explain why. They were smaller than I expected, sleeker, built with none of the layered armor plating that Coalition engineers favored. If anything, they reminded me of predator creatures I had seen on hunting worlds as a child, animals built not for defense but for speed and precision. A communication request appeared on my console, marked with an unfamiliar signature. I accepted it immediately. The voice that came through was human, calm in a way that felt almost unnatural given the circumstances. There was no static in the transmission, no urgency in the tone, nothing that suggested this person understood they had just entered a war zone that had already consumed hundreds of ships and thousands of lives. "This is Fleet Commander Daniel Voss of the Earth Expeditionary Force," the voice said. "We received your coordinates. Where do you need us?" I paused before answering, choosing my words carefully. "Commander Voss, I appreciate your arrival, but I must ask, is this truly the full extent of the force Earth is sending?" We are facing an enemy that has already overwhelmed multiple coalition fleets. There was a brief pause on the other end, and when Voss spoke again, there was no defensiveness in his voice, only a strange, quiet certainty that I did not know how to interpret. "This is our forward element, Commander Thal," he said. "We prefer to assess the situation directly before committing additional resources. Please transmit your current battle lines and enemy disposition." I sent the data immediately, watching as the numbers populated across every screen on my bridge. Enemy fleet strength, coalition losses, territory ceded over the past 6 days. It was not a flattering picture. If anything, it was a portrait of a losing war, laid bare for a species we barely knew. There was silence on the channel for nearly a full minute after the data transfer completed. I found myself holding my breath, half expecting Voss to inform me that Earth had made a mistake, that the situation was beyond what they were prepared to engage, that they would be withdrawing before the Ashvale even noticed their arrival. Instead, his voice returned, and something in his tone had shifted, though I could not immediately place what it was. "Understood," he said simply. "We will begin operations within the hour." The channel closed before I could respond. I turned to Asya, who was staring at her own display with an expression I recognized as barely contained disbelief. "Commander, they intend to engage with only 42 ships? Against a force this size?" I did not have an answer for her. I only watched as the human fleet began to move, and it was in that moment that I first noticed something strange about the way their ships handled themselves in space. Coalition vessels moved with careful, measured precision, always maintaining formation distances calculated to maximize mutual defense coverage. It was a doctrine built over centuries of warfare, refined and perfected through countless engagements. The human ships did not follow this pattern at all. They spread apart in a formation that made no immediate sense to me, wide gaps between vessels that any coalition tactician would have called reckless. But as I watched longer, I began to notice a pattern beneath the apparent disorder. Each ship was positioning itself with a clear line of sight to multiple potential enemy approach vectors, covering angles that traditional coalition formations left exposed. "They are not defending each other in the way we would," I murmured, mostly to myself. "They are covering territory." Dross, still at his weapons station, shook his head slowly. "It looks like they have no idea what they are doing." I was not so certain. I had spent years studying old reports on human military history, and one detail kept surfacing in my memory, a detail I had always dismissed as exaggeration until this exact moment. Human strategists, according to those old files, rarely fought battles the way anyone expected them to. They adapted constantly, discarded old methods the moment those methods stopped working, and treated established doctrine as a starting point rather than an unbreakable rule. I watched the tactical display as the first Ashvale scout vessels appeared at the edge of our detection range, moving toward the human formation with the same confidence they had shown against every coalition fleet before this one. The Ashvale had learned our patterns over months of fighting. They knew exactly how coalition ships would respond, exactly where the weaknesses in our formations lay, exactly how to exploit the predictable nature of our defense. They had no such knowledge of the humans. "Enemy scouts adjusting course toward the human fleet," Asya reported, her voice tense. I leaned forward, watching closely. This would tell me everything I needed to know. If the humans panicked now, if they broke formation or requested immediate support, it would confirm every doubt the Council had voiced about relying on such an unproven ally. Instead, the human formation did not move at all. They held their position, ships spread wide across the approach vector, weapon systems powering up in a pattern I did not immediately recognize. There was no retreat, no defensive contraction, nothing that suggested fear or hesitation. Just a quiet, patient stillness that felt almost more unsettling than an aggressive charge would have been. "They are letting the scouts get closer," Dross said, disbelief coloring his voice. "Why would they do that?" I did not answer him, because I was beginning to suspect something that I did not yet want to say aloud. I suspected that the human commander already understood exactly what he was facing, that this apparent passivity was not hesitation at all, but calculation. The Ashvale scouts closed to engagement range, and for the first time since their arrival, I watched the human fleet respond. It happened faster than my sensors could properly track in real time. One moment the scout vessels were approaching in their standard probing formation, testing for weaknesses the way they always did, before committing a larger force. The next moment, 3 of those scouts had gone dark on my display, their signatures vanishing entirely. "What happened?" I demanded, turning to Ossia. She stared at her console, her 4 eyes wide. "Commander, I am reading successful engagement from the human fleet. 3 enemy scouts neutralized." Firing solutions were, "Commander, the targeting precision on these engagements is unlike anything in our combat logs." I looked back at the tactical display, watching as the remaining Ashvale scouts scattered, breaking off their approach and retreating toward the main enemy formation. In all my years fighting the Ashvale, I had never once seen their scouts retreat without inflicting damage. They were disposable to their command structure, expected to gather information regardless of losses, never designed to flee from a threat. But they were fleeing now. "Commander Voss," I said into the open channel, unable to keep the disbelief from my voice. "Your fleet successfully engaged 3 enemy vessels with what appears to be minimal effort. May I ask how this was achieved?" There was a brief pause before Voss responded, and when he did, his voice carried the same calm, measured tone as before, as if what had just happened was entirely unremarkable to him. "Standard engagement protocol, Commander Thal," he said. "We identified their sensor blind spots based on your provided combat data and positioned accordingly. Their scouts were not expecting resistance from that angle." I sat back in my chair, processing what I had just witnessed. 42 ships had arrived to reinforce a defense line that had already lost nearly 150 vessels, and within moments of their first engagement, they had already demonstrated a level of tactical awareness that no coalition fleet had managed in 6 days of fighting. "Commander," Ossia said quietly, "the main Ashvale formation is beginning to redirect. It appears the loss of their scouts has prompted a change in their approach pattern." I felt something shift inside me as I watched the enemy formation adjust on the display, moving with visible caution for the first time since this war began. The Ashvale, an enemy that had never once hesitated against coalition forces, was hesitating now. I did not yet know what this meant for the battle ahead. I did not know if 42 human ships could truly hold against a force that had already broken 3 coalition fleets. But for the first time in 6 days, I felt something other than dread settle into my chest as I watched the humans prepare for what was coming. I felt the smallest flicker of something I had almost forgotten existed after days of constant loss. I felt hope, fragile and uncertain, but present all the same. And somewhere beneath that fragile hope, a quieter thought began to form, one that would only grow stronger as the hours ahead unfolded. I began to wonder if we had spent 300 years underestimating a species that had simply never needed to show us what it was truly capable of. I would not have to wonder for much longer. The main Ashvale formation began its advance 40 minutes after losing the scout vessels, and I felt the entire bridge tense around me as the enemy numbers populated across the tactical display. 312 ships. Against our combined force of 60 coalition vessels and 42 human ships, barely 100 in total. I had commanded fleets for over 20 years, and I knew the mathematics of warfare well enough to understand what those numbers meant under normal circumstances. Under normal circumstances, this battle would already be lost before the first shot was fired. "Commander Thal," Voss said over the open channel, his voice as steady as it had been during our first conversation, "we will take point on this engagement. Please have your fleet maintain defensive positions along the rear approach and provide support fire only when directly requested." I bristled slightly at the suggestion, old pride flaring despite everything I had already witnessed. "Commander Voss, my fleet has been fighting this enemy for 6 days. We are not inexperienced." "I understand, Commander," Voss replied, and there was no condescension in his voice, only a strange kind of patience that somehow made his words easier to accept. This is not a judgment of your fleet's capability. It is a matter of coordination. Our combat doctrine differs significantly from coalition standards, and mixed formations create unnecessary risk during the opening phase of engagement. Once we establish battlefield control, we will integrate your fleet into offensive operations. I looked at Asya, who gave me a small, uncertain nod, and then at Dross, who simply shrugged, still clearly skeptical, despite what we had already seen from the human scouts' engagement. "Understood, Commander Voss," I said finally. "We will hold position and await your direction." The Ashvale formation continued its advance, 312 ships moving in the dense, overwhelming swarm pattern that had become horrifyingly familiar to every coalition commander over the past several months. They did not believe in subtlety. Their strategy relied entirely on overwhelming numbers, throwing so many ships into an engagement that even significant losses on their side could not prevent them from grinding down whatever defense stood in their path. It had worked against us for 6 days. I watched the human formation begin to move, and once again, their behavior defied everything I expected from a defending force. Rather than consolidating into a tight defensive cluster to weather the incoming assault, the 42 ships spread even further apart, forming a loose net across a section of space nearly 3 times wider than a coalition fleet of similar size would ever occupy. "They are spreading too thin," Dross said, his voice tight with tension. "The Ashvale will simply flow around the gaps and overwhelm them from multiple directions." I said nothing, though privately I shared his concern. Whatever confidence I had begun to build after witnessing the scout engagement was being tested severely now, watching 42 ships position themselves against a force nearly 8 times their number. The Ashvale swarm closed the distance, and I braced myself for what I expected to be a chaotic, desperate battle, one where the humans would quickly find themselves overwhelmed and forced to call for the support fire they had initially declined. Instead, what I witnessed over the following minutes would remain burned into my memory for the rest of my life. The moment the Ashvale formation entered engagement range, the human fleet opened fire with a coordinated precision that made my earlier observation of their scout engagement look almost accidental by comparison. Every ship fired not at the nearest target, but at specific vessels deep within the swarm formation, and it took me several seconds to understand what I was actually seeing. "They are targeting command vessels," Asya said, her voice rising with disbelief as she studied the data flooding her console. "Commander, they identified and prioritized Ashvale coordination ships before the engagement even began." I stared at the display in stunned silence. The Ashvale swarm relied entirely on a distributed command structure, a handful of specialized vessels hidden within the larger formation that coordinated the movements of the rest. Coalition intelligence had spent months trying to identify these command vessels through observation, with only limited success. The humans had apparently identified them within the span of a single engagement, using nothing more than the combat data I had provided less than an hour earlier. As those command vessels began to fall, one after another, I watched something remarkable happen across the entire Ashvale formation. The swarm, which had moved with terrifying unified purpose against every coalition fleet for 6 days, began to fracture. Groups of ships that had once moved in perfect coordination started drifting into conflicting patterns, some continuing their advance, while others hesitated, clearly no longer receiving clear direction from a command structure that was rapidly being dismantled. "Their formation is breaking down," I said, hardly able to believe the words as I spoke them. "Commander Thal," Voss's voice came through the channel, still calm despite the chaos unfolding on my display. "We are seeing significant disruption in enemy coordination. Recommend your fleet begin selective engagement against isolated groups, now separated from the main formation. We will continue targeting remaining command elements." I gave the order immediately, watching as my own ships, finally given a clear and achievable objective, began moving against the scattered, disorganized clusters of Ashvale vessels that had once been part of an overwhelming, unified swarm. For the first time in 6 days, my fleet was not simply trying to survive an assault. We were actively winning engagements. The battle that followed was unlike anything I had experienced in my entire career. Where the Ashvale had once moved with terrifying, unstoppable purpose, they now fought as fragmented, uncoordinated groups, easy targets for a coalition fleet that finally had the breathing room to fight intelligently rather than desperately. I watched enemy ship after enemy ship fall across my display, and slowly, the overwhelming numerical advantage that had defined this war for 6 days began to erode. But it was the human fleet that truly commanded my attention throughout the engagement. I watched them move through the battlefield with an efficiency that bordered on unsettling. There was no wasted motion in their maneuvers, no ships firing at targets already marked for destruction by another vessel, no duplicated effort of any kind. Every engagement seemed calculated down to the smallest detail, as if the entire human fleet was operating as a single coordinated entity rather than 42 individual ships making independent decisions. "Commander," Ossia said, pulling my attention back to her station, "I am detecting something unusual in the human fleet's communication patterns. Their coordination speed exceeds anything I have seen from coalition command networks. It is almost as though they are anticipating each other's movements before they happen." I did not have an explanation for her, though I suspected the old reports I had read on humanity, reports describing training methods and command structures that prioritized adaptability and instinct over rigid protocol, held some part of the answer. Whatever the reason, the result was a fighting force that moved with a level of cohesion I had never witnessed from any coalition fleet in my career. 2 hours into the engagement, the tide of battle had shifted so dramatically that I found myself struggling to reconcile what I was watching with the desperate defense we had been fighting only a day earlier. The Ashvale formation, once numbering over 300 ships, had been reduced to scattered remnants, fleeing in disorganized retreat rather than pressing their earlier overwhelming advantage. "Commander Voss," I said into the channel, watching as another cluster of retreating enemy vessels vanished from my display. "Your fleet's performance in this engagement has been—" "I do not have adequate words to describe what I have witnessed today." "We appreciate the sentiment, Commander Thal," Voss replied, and for the first time since our conversations began, I heard something that might have been the faintest trace of warmth in his otherwise measured tone. "But this engagement is not yet finished. The Ashvale retains significant reserve forces beyond this initial formation. We recommend continuing pursuit operations while their command structure remains disrupted." I nodded, though he could not see the gesture, and gave the order for my fleet to continue the assault. As my ships moved to pursue the retreating remnants of what had once been an unstoppable enemy formation, I found myself reflecting on everything I had witnessed over the past several hours. I thought of the desperate message sent from our council less than a week earlier, born from a fear that our entire civilization might collapse under an enemy we could not stop. I thought of my own doubts upon seeing only 42 human ships arrive in response, certain that such a small force could offer little more than a symbolic gesture against overwhelming odds. And I thought of the quiet, unassuming voice of Commander Daniel Voss, who had spoken of engaging an enemy fleet nearly 8 times his own size with the same calm certainty most commanders reserved for routine training exercises. "Commander," Dross said from his station, his earlier skepticism now replaced with something closer to stunned respect. "Current estimates suggest we have reduced enemy fleet strength by over 70% in less than 2 hours." I looked at the tactical display, watching the scattered remains of the Ashvale formation continue their retreat, pursued relentlessly by a combined force that had transformed from a desperate, failing defense into something approaching an unstoppable offensive. 2 hours, I repeated quietly, mostly to myself. 6 days of losses, and it took them 2 hours to change everything. I did not yet know how the rest of this battle would unfold, or what remaining reserves the Ashvale might still bring to bear against us. But watching the human fleet continue their methodical, precise dismantling of an enemy that had once seemed unstoppable, I began to understand something that would reshape everything I thought I knew about the nature of warfare itself. We had spent 300 years believing humanity was too young, too inexperienced, too limited in their reach to matter in a conflict of this scale. We had invoked their old pact only as a final, desperate measure, never truly believing they could offer anything beyond a token gesture of solidarity. I was beginning to realize just how wrong that belief had been, and somewhere in the back of my mind, a quieter, more unsettling thought began to take shape, one I could not yet fully articulate, but that would grow louder with each passing hour of this engagement. If this was what humanity looked like when finally given a reason to fight, I found myself wondering what exactly they had been capable of all along, quietly waiting behind the borders of their small, unassuming world. I would not have to wait long to find out. The third hour of the engagement began with a development none of us had anticipated, and it would prove to be the moment that truly revealed the depth of what humanity had brought to this war. "Commander Thal," Ossia said, her voice sharp with urgency, "long-range sensors are detecting a significant Ashvale reserve fleet emerging from behind the outer debris field. Estimated strength is over 400 vessels." I felt my chest tighten as I processed the number. We had already spent 2 grueling hours reducing the initial Ashvale formation, and my fleet, despite the incredible turnaround provided by human intervention, was far from unscathed. We had lost 11 ships in the fighting so far, and many of the vessels still active carried significant damage. A fresh reserve force of 400 ships represented a threat even larger than what we had originally faced. "They held back their true numbers," I said, mostly to myself, though Dross heard me and nodded grimly from his station. "It matches reports from other fronts," he said. "The Ashvale have used staged reserves against other coalition defense lines before. They let the initial wave probe our strength, then commit their true numbers once weaknesses are identified." I opened the channel to Voss immediately, bracing myself for what I expected to be the first sign of hesitation from the human fleet since their arrival. 400 fresh ships against a combined force that had already spent 2 hours in continuous engagement seemed like exactly the kind of overwhelming escalation that would finally force a change in their calm, measured approach. "Commander Voss," I said, "we are detecting a major Ashvale reserve force, estimated at 400 vessels, emerging from the outer debris field. This significantly exceeds our current combined strength." There was a brief pause before Voss responded, and when his voice came through, I heard something I had not expected. Not concern, not hesitation, but something that almost sounded like quiet satisfaction. "Understood, Commander Thal," he said. "This is consistent with projected enemy behavior based on the combat data you provided earlier. We anticipated a reserve commitment of this scale." I stared at the channel display, momentarily speechless. "You anticipated this?" "Ashvale Command Doctrine follows a predictable pattern once sufficient data is available," Voss explained, his tone as calm as though he were discussing routine logistics rather than an approaching force nearly 4 times our current numbers. "Initial forces test defensive capability. Reserve forces are committed once perceived weaknesses are identified. We have been operating under the assumption that this reserve fleet would emerge once the primary formation suffered sufficient losses." I did not know how to respond to this. The idea that the human fleet had not only anticipated this exact escalation, but had apparently planned their entire engagement strategy around provoking it, was almost more unsettling than the arrival of the reserve fleet itself. "Commander," Voss continued, "we recommend your fleet consolidate into a defensive formation near the debris field's inner boundary. Our forces will handle the primary engagement against the reserve fleet directly." I felt old pride flare within me once again, the same instinct that had bristled at his suggestion hours earlier. But this time, that instinct was tempered by everything I had already witnessed. I no longer had room for doubt about the capability of the forces we had been given. "Understood, Commander Voss," I said. "My fleet will hold position and provide support as directed." As my ships repositioned according to his instructions, I watched the human fleet begin to redistribute across the battlefield, adjusting their formation to face this new, overwhelming threat. Even now, even facing numbers that should have demanded a defensive posture, I noticed no hesitation in their movements, no sign of the caution I would have expected from any coalition fleet facing similar odds. The Ashvale Reserve Fleet advanced with the same aggressive, overwhelming swarm pattern that had defined their initial assault, 400 ships moving as a single, terrifying mass toward a combined defense force that, even with human reinforcement, numbered barely over 100 vessels. "Commander," Osea said quietly, "enemy reserve fleet will reach engagement range in approximately 6 minutes." I watched the countdown on my display, feeling the same tension I had experienced during every major engagement of this war, but this time, that tension was mixed with something new. Not the desperate hope of a fleet fighting for survival, but a strange, curious anticipation, wondering exactly how the human fleet intended to handle a threat of this magnitude. I did not have to wait long to find out. The moment the Ashvale Reserve Fleet crossed into engagement range, the human formation executed a maneuver unlike anything I had witnessed in 6 days of warfare. Rather than meeting the swarm head-on, the 42 ships split into 3 distinct groups, each moving along a different vector, converging on the enemy formation from multiple angles simultaneously. "They are using a pincer formation," Dross said, disbelief evident in his voice, "against a force 10 times their number." I watched as the human groups opened fire, and once again, their targeting priority became immediately apparent. They were not attacking the nearest ships or the largest concentrations of enemy vessels. They were systematically identifying and eliminating specific targets deep within the swarm, ships that I quickly realized must represent secondary command structures, backup coordination vessels the Ashvale had apparently held in reserve specifically for situations like this one. "They identified a secondary command network," Osea said, her voice filled with growing amazement as she studied the unfolding battle. "Commander, the Ashvale built redundancy into their reserve fleet's command structure, specifically to prevent the kind of disruption we saw in the initial engagement. The human fleet identified this redundancy and is targeting it directly." I felt a chill run through me as I processed what this meant. The Ashvale, an enemy that had spent months adapting and refining their tactics against coalition forces, had specifically prepared countermeasures against exactly the kind of disruption the human fleet had used earlier in this battle. And the human fleet had not only anticipated this preparation, they had identified the specific weakness in that countermeasure within moments of engaging it. The battle that followed was the most intense fighting I had witnessed throughout this entire war. The Ashvale Reserve Fleet, despite their redundant command structure, began to falter under the relentless, precise assault from the human formation. Ships fell in waves, secondary command vessels eliminated one after another, as the human fleet methodically dismantled every layer of coordination the enemy had built into their reserve force. But it was not without cost. "Commander," Osea said, her voice tight with concern. "Human fleet reporting damage to 3 vessels. One appears to be losing propulsion capability." I watched the tactical display closely, my earlier confidence tempered by the sudden, sharp reminder that even this remarkable fleet was not invincible. I opened the channel immediately. "Commander Voss, we are detecting damage to your fleet. Do you require support?" "Negative, Commander Thal," Voss replied, though I noticed a slight strain in his voice that had not been present during our earlier conversations. "Damaged vessel is being covered by adjacent units. Maintain your current position." I watched as 2 human ships adjusted their formation, moving to shield the damaged vessel from further enemy fire while continuing to engage the Ashvale formation with undiminished intensity. There was no panic in their response, no sign of the fleet losing cohesion, despite taking their first significant losses of the engagement. If anything, the remaining ships seemed to fight with even sharper precision, as though the damage to their formation had only sharpened their focus rather than diminishing it. An hour into the engagement against the reserve fleet, I watched the tide of battle shift decisively in our favor once again. The Ashvale formation, stripped of both its primary and secondary command structures, began to fragment exactly as the earlier wave had, ships scattering into disorganized, uncoordinated clusters that fell quickly to the combined pressure of human precision and coalition numbers. "Commander," Dross said, his voice filled with something approaching awe as he studied the updated battle statistics. "Enemy reserve fleet strength has been reduced by over 60%. Remaining forces are showing clear signs of retreat." I looked at the tactical display, watching the remnants of what had once been a 400-ship reserve force scatter into full retreat, pursued relentlessly by a combined fleet that, despite everything thrown against it over the past 3 hours, remained a cohesive, functioning fighting force. I opened the channel to Voss once more, unable to fully contain the disbelief in my voice. "Commander Voss, your fleet has now successfully engaged and defeated 2 separate Ashvale formations, totaling over 700 combined vessels, in a span of less than 3 hours. I find myself struggling to understand how this was achieved with a force of only 42 ships." There was a pause before Voss responded, and when he did, I heard something in his voice that I had not expected from a commander who had, until this moment, spoken with nothing but calm, measured professionalism. I heard something that sounded almost like weariness, though not the weariness of exhaustion. It was closer to the weariness of someone who had done this before, many times, in circumstances I could not yet fully imagine. "Commander Thal," he said quietly, "humanity has spent a very long time learning how to fight wars that we did not choose to start. This is not the first time we have faced an enemy that believed numbers alone would be enough to guarantee victory." I did not know how to respond to this. Something in his tone told me there was far more history behind those words than he was willing to share in the middle of an active engagement, a weight of experience that hinted at struggles humanity had faced long before they ever encountered the Coalition or the Ashvale. "Regardless," Voss continued, his tone returning to its usual calm efficiency, "this reserve fleet's defeat likely represents the majority of remaining Ashvale forces in this sector. We recommend continuing pursuit operations to prevent any surviving elements from regrouping." I gave the order immediately, watching as my fleet moved to join the human formation in hunting down the last scattered remnants of an enemy that had, only hours earlier, seemed on the verge of achieving total victory over everything the Coalition had built. As the pursuit continued, I found myself reflecting on everything that had unfolded since that first quiet transmission arrived, in response to our desperate call for help. I thought of my own doubts upon seeing only 42 ships arrive, certain that such a small force could never turn the tide of a war that had already claimed hundreds of Coalition vessels. I thought of the strange, unsettling calm in Commander Voss's voice, a calm that I now understood was not naivety or overconfidence, but the quiet certainty of someone who had faced overwhelming odds many times before and had simply learned, through whatever difficult history had shaped his people, exactly how to win. 3 hours into this engagement, an enemy that had crushed 3 Coalition fleets and seemed destined to overrun our entire defense line had been reduced to scattered, fleeing remnants, pursued by a combined force that, against all reasonable expectation, had proven itself capable of achieving, in mere hours, what our own fleets had failed to accomplish in 6 long, brutal days. I did not yet know how much longer this battle would last, or what final challenges the retreating Ashvale forces might still present. But watching the human fleet continue their relentless, precise pursuit, I understood with growing certainty that we were witnessing something far greater than a simple military victory. We were witnessing the true capability of a species that had spent 300 years remaining quietly on the edge of Coalition affairs, never revealing the full extent of what they were capable of, until the exact moment they were finally needed. I found myself wondering, with a mixture of relief and quiet unease, what else humanity might be capable of that we had never been given reason to witness. I would find out before this day was finished. The 4th hour of the engagement brought with it a kind of exhausted clarity that settled over my bridge as we pursued the remaining scattered fragments of what had once been an overwhelming Ashvale force. "Commander," Ossia reported, her voice steadier now than it had been at any point since this battle began. "Remaining enemy strength across all engaged formations is estimated at less than 80 vessels, scattered across multiple retreat vectors." I studied the tactical display, watching as those retreating remnants tried desperately to reorganize into some semblance of coordinated defense, only to be picked apart methodically by a human fleet that showed no signs of slowing despite hours of continuous engagement. What had begun as a desperate defense against overwhelming numbers had transformed, through means I still struggled to fully comprehend, into a systematic dismantling of an enemy that had once seemed unstoppable. "Commander Voss," I said into the open channel, watching as another cluster of enemy ships vanished from my display. "Your fleet's endurance throughout this engagement has been remarkable. I would have expected fatigue to become a factor by this point." "Human physiology and our vessel systems are designed with extended engagement periods in mind, Commander Thal," Voss replied, though I noted a slight change in the rhythm of his speech, subtle signs that even this remarkable commander was not entirely unaffected by the hours of continuous combat. "We anticipated this engagement could extend beyond initial projections." I found myself curious about something that had been building in my mind throughout the entire battle, a question I had held back out of respect for the ongoing engagement, but could no longer resist asking. "Commander Voss, if I may ask, how did your forces develop such precise understanding of Ashvale tactics within hours of first encountering them? Coalition intelligence spent months attempting similar analysis with far less success." There was a brief pause before Voss answered, and I sensed him choosing his words carefully. "Humanity has extensive experience analyzing conflict patterns across a wide range of adversaries, Commander Thal. The specific tactics employed by the Ashvale, while unfamiliar to us in their execution, follow underlying strategic principles that are not entirely unique in the broader history of warfare. Numerical superiority combined with distributed command structures represents a common approach across many different conflicts, including several from our own history." I considered this response carefully, recognizing that it revealed far less than it seemed to on the surface. There was history behind those words, a depth of experience that Voss was clearly choosing not to elaborate on, at least not during an active engagement. I made a mental note to revisit this conversation once the battle concluded, curiosity about humanity's true history growing stronger with every passing hour of this remarkable demonstration. As the pursuit continued, my own fleet finally received the opportunity to contribute more directly to the engagement, no longer relegated to secondary support roles as the primary Ashvale formations had been broken. I watched with something approaching pride as my remaining ships engaged scattered enemy remnants with renewed confidence, finally able to fight on terms that favored coordinated strength rather than desperate survival. "Commander," Dross called out, his voice carrying an edge of alarm that immediately drew my full attention. "Human vessel Meridian is taking sustained fire from a group of Ashvale ships that broke away from the main retreat pattern. They appear to have identified it as the damaged vessel from earlier engagement." I looked at the display, watching as 5 Ashvale ships had indeed broken formation, converging on the human vessel that had suffered propulsion damage during the reserve fleet engagement hours earlier. Despite the damage, the Meridian continued firing, but its reduced mobility made it a clear target for an enemy group that had apparently recognized weakness and moved to exploit it. I did not hesitate. "Redirect the Caisson and the Voltaine to support that vessel immediately," I ordered, watching as 2 of my own cruisers broke from their current engagement to move toward the beleaguered human ship. What happened next would remain one of the clearest memories I carry from this entire war. As my ships moved to intercept, I watched one of the human vessels, a smaller craft that had been engaging elsewhere in the battle, suddenly change course with a speed and precision that defied every expectation I had developed about their fleet's capabilities. It moved directly into the path of incoming fire meant for the damaged Meridian, absorbing a barrage that would have otherwise struck the crippled vessel directly. "Commander," Ossia said, her voice shaking slightly, That ship just took direct fire meant for the Meridian. Damage report indicates significant hull compromise. I opened the channel immediately, my chest tight with an emotion I had not expected to feel toward a fleet I had known for only a few hours. Commander Voss, one of your vessels has sustained critical damage protecting the Meridian. Do you require immediate support? The response, when it came, carried a tone I had not heard from Voss throughout the entire engagement, something that sounded almost like quiet pride mixed with sorrow. Understood, Commander Thal. That vessel's actions were consistent with standard protective doctrine. Please continue your support toward the Meridian's position. We will handle recovery operations for the damaged vessel. I watched as my own cruisers arrived to reinforce the human ships, finally engaging the Ashvale group that had targeted the vulnerable Meridian directly. Between the combined firepower of my vessels and the continued undiminished intensity of the human fleet's response, the enemy group was eliminated within minutes, but the cost of that engagement lingered heavily in my thoughts. Status on the damaged human vessel? I asked, watching the display closely. It remains operational, Commander, Asia reported, relief evident in her voice, though sustaining significant damage. Human medical and repair teams appear to be responding with remarkable speed. I found myself watching that damaged vessel's icon on my display for several long moments, reflecting on what I had just witnessed. A human ship had willingly placed itself directly in harm's way to protect a comrade, without hesitation, without waiting for orders, reacting with an instinct that I recognized immediately as something far deeper than simple military protocol. It was the kind of instinct that spoke to genuine care between crew members, a willingness to sacrifice for one another that went beyond duty or obligation. I had witnessed similar acts of courage among coalition forces throughout this long war, but something about the immediacy and precision of the human vessel's response felt different, as though this kind of protective instinct was simply woven into the very fabric of how they operated as a fleet. As the engagement continued into its final phase, the remaining scattered Ashvale forces found themselves with nowhere left to retreat, pursued relentlessly across every possible vector by a combined fleet that, despite hours of continuous fighting and mounting damage, showed no sign of relenting. Commander, Dross reported, his voice now carrying a note of genuine astonishment, rather than the skepticism he had displayed at the beginning of this engagement. Remaining enemy strength has fallen below 20 vessels. Several appear to be attempting surrender protocols, though our translation systems have never encountered Ashvale surrender signals before. I stared at the display, trying to process the reality of what those words meant. In 6 months of warfare against this enemy, no coalition fleet had ever witnessed an Ashvale vessel attempt to surrender. They fought until destruction, every single time, a behavior that had led our own intelligence analysts to conclude they simply lacked any concept of tactical retreat or negotiated surrender. Commander Voss, I said, my voice carrying genuine uncertainty for the first time in hours, we are detecting what may be surrender signals from remaining Ashvale vessels. This behavior has never been documented before in this conflict. How should we proceed? There was a thoughtful pause before Voss responded. Recommend allowing those vessels to power down weapons and communication arrays under close observation, Commander Thal. If this represents genuine surrender behavior, it may provide valuable intelligence regarding Ashvale command structure and motivations that could prove useful for the broader conflict beyond this single engagement. I gave the order, watching with a mixture of curiosity and lingering caution as the remaining Ashvale vessels powered down their weapons systems, drifting silently amid the wreckage of what had once been an overwhelming force of over 700 ships. It was a surreal sight after 6 days of desperate, unrelenting warfare, watching the same enemy that had shown no mercy or hesitation throughout this entire conflict suddenly reduced to a handful of powerless, drifting vessels. Commander, Asia said quietly, studying her sensor readings with evident disbelief. Current battle assessment indicates the Ashvale offensive force in this sector has been effectively neutralized. Total engagement duration from initial human fleet contact stands at approximately 4 hours and 30 minutes. I sat back in my chair, trying to fully absorb the magnitude of what had just happened. 4.5 hours. An enemy that had crushed 3 coalition fleets over 6 days of relentless warfare. A force that had seemed destined to overwhelm our entire defense line and threaten the survival of everything the coalition had built, had been effectively defeated in less time than it took to complete a single standard patrol rotation. I opened the channel to Voss one final time before the last phase of this engagement would begin, my voice carrying a weight of gratitude and disbelief that I could not fully contain. Commander Voss, on behalf of the Coalition 3rd Defense Line, and I believe on behalf of everyone within Coalition space, I offer our deepest gratitude for what your fleet has accomplished here today. I do not have adequate words to express what this victory means for us. Voss's response, when it came, carried none of the pride or satisfaction I might have expected from a commander who had just achieved what seemed like an impossible victory. Instead, his voice carried something quieter, more contemplative, tinged with an exhaustion that finally revealed itself after hours of unwavering composure. "We understand what desperation looks like, Commander Thal," he said. "We are glad we could help before it was too late for your people." I did not yet fully understand the depth of history behind those words, the weight of experience that allowed a fleet of only 42 ships to achieve what an entire coalition defense line had failed to accomplish over 6 brutal days. But I understood, with absolute certainty, that everything I thought I knew about humanity, about their capabilities, their history, and their true nature as a species, had been fundamentally incomplete. As the final remnants of the Ashvale offensive drifted silently among the wreckage of their own overwhelming defeat, I found myself looking toward the human fleet with a mixture of gratitude, curiosity, and a quiet, growing sense of awe that I suspected would remain with me for the rest of my life. The battle was nearly finished, but I sensed, somehow, that the true story of what humanity had just revealed to the galaxy was only beginning. The silence that followed the final surrender of the remaining Ashvale vessels felt almost unnatural after 6 days of relentless warfare and hours of intense, continuous engagement. I sat on my bridge, watching the tactical display slowly clear of hostile signatures, replaced instead by damage reports, recovery operations, and the quiet, methodical process of securing a battlefield that had, only hours earlier, seemed destined to become another devastating coalition defeat. "Commander," Ossia said softly, her voice carrying the exhausted relief of someone who had spent 6 days bracing for catastrophe and was only now beginning to process the reality of survival. "Final engagement statistics are complete. Total Ashvale force eliminated across this sector stands at over 780 vessels. Coalition losses for this engagement, including forces committed prior to human arrival, total 18 ships. Human fleet losses stand at 0, with 3 vessels sustaining significant damage requiring extended repair." I stared at those numbers for a long moment, trying to reconcile them with everything I had witnessed over the past 5 hours. 780 enemy vessels destroyed, 0 human losses. It seemed almost impossible, a result so lopsided that it defied every principle of warfare I had studied throughout my entire career. "Total engagement duration, from initial human fleet contact to final Ashvale surrender," Ossia continued, her voice carrying a note of quiet disbelief, "stands at exactly 5 hours and 6 minutes. 5 hours. I thought of the 6 days my fleet had spent fighting a desperate, losing battle against this same enemy, watching ship after ship fall, watching territory collapse under relentless assault that seemed impossible to stop. And in 5 hours, a force of only 42 human ships had accomplished what our combined coalition strength had failed to achieve across nearly a week of continuous warfare. I opened a private channel to Commander Voss, requesting a direct meeting rather than another simple exchange over communications. To my quiet surprise, he agreed immediately, and within the hour, a small human shuttle docked with my flagship, carrying the man whose calm, measured voice had guided this remarkable victory. When Daniel Voss stepped onto my bridge, I found myself studying him carefully, searching for some outward sign of the extraordinary capability I had witnessed throughout this engagement. He was, physically, entirely unremarkable, a man of average height and build, with tired eyes that carried the weight of hours of continuous combat, and a quiet, almost apologetic demeanor that felt entirely at odds with the devastating efficiency his fleet had just demonstrated. "Commander Thal," he said, extending a hand in a gesture I recognized from old diplomatic records as a traditional human greeting. "I am glad we arrived in time to make a difference." I clasped his hand, still processing the strange disconnect between this quiet, unassuming man and the overwhelming military capability he had just displayed. "Commander Voss, I find myself struggling to fully express the gratitude the Coalition owes your people for what you accomplished here today. 780 enemy vessels destroyed, with no losses among your own fleet. I have never witnessed anything like it in my entire career." Voss's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been discomfort crossing his tired features. "I understand this must seem remarkable from your perspective, Commander Thal. I want to be honest with you, though I recognize the timing may seem unusual given the circumstances." I gestured for him to continue, curious about what he might reveal now that the immediate crisis had passed. "Humanity did not arrive here with 42 ships, because that represented the full extent of what we could offer," Voss said quietly. "We arrived with a limited force because we needed to first assess the true scale of the threat you were facing, and because our full military commitment requires approval processes that extend beyond what a single fleet commander can authorize independently." I felt something cold settle into my chest as I processed this admission. "You are saying this was not your full strength?" "This was a fraction of what we could have committed, Commander Thal," Voss confirmed, and I heard genuine sincerity in his voice, not boastfulness, but something closer to solemn honesty. "Humanity has spent a significant portion of our recorded history engaged in conflicts of far greater scale and complexity than what we encountered here today. When your council's request arrived, our leadership made the decision to send an advance force capable of decisive engagement, both to provide immediate relief to your defense line and to demonstrate our capability before committing to a broader alliance." I sat back, trying to fully absorb what this meant. The battle I had just witnessed, a battle that had seemed almost impossibly one-sided from my perspective, represented not humanity's full capability, but merely a demonstration, a careful first step toward a larger relationship between our two civilizations. "Commander Voss," I said slowly, "may I ask what history you speak of? What conflicts could possibly have prepared your people for warfare of this precision and scale?" Voss was quiet for a long moment, and I sensed him weighing how much to share, how much context an alien commander could truly absorb about a history he had only begun to glimpse through the events of the past 5 hours. "Humanity spent a very long period of our history fighting among ourselves," he said finally. "Conflicts that, by the time we finally achieved unity as a species, had claimed more lives and consumed more resources than most civilizations experience across their entire recorded history. We learned, through painful and repeated experience, exactly what it takes to fight and win wars against opponents who believe overwhelming force alone guarantees victory. The Ashvale's tactics, while unfamiliar to us in specific execution, followed patterns we have encountered many times before, across many different conflicts throughout our own difficult history." I considered this explanation carefully, beginning to understand, at least in part, the depth of experience that had allowed a fleet of only 42 ships to accomplish what an entire coalition defense line had failed to achieve. It was not simply superior technology or unexpected tactical brilliance. It was the product of a species that had, through immense and difficult struggle, developed an understanding of warfare that our own peaceful cooperative history had simply never required us to develop. "The coalition has enjoyed centuries of relative peace since our founding," I said quietly, mostly reflecting aloud rather than directing the words specifically at Voss. "We built our military doctrine around defense and mutual protection between allied worlds, never truly anticipating an enemy capable of the kind of overwhelming, relentless assault the Ash Veil brought against us. And that is precisely why our assistance proved valuable here, Commander Thal, Voss said, his tone carrying quiet reassurance rather than any hint of superiority. Your coalition's approach to warfare reflects the values of a peaceful, cooperative civilization, values that speak well of the kind of society you have built. Humanity's approach to warfare reflects a very different history, one shaped by necessity rather than choice. Neither approach is inherently superior. They simply reflect different paths shaped by very different circumstances. I found myself genuinely moved by this response, recognizing in his words a humility that I had not expected from a commander who had just achieved one of the most remarkable military victories I had ever witnessed. There was no arrogance in his explanation, no suggestion that humanity viewed themselves as superior to the coalition despite the overwhelming disparity in combat effectiveness demonstrated throughout this engagement. "Commander Voss," I said, "what happens now? Given what your fleet has demonstrated here today, I imagine the Coalition Council will have significant interest in formalizing a much deeper alliance with Earth." Voss nodded slowly. "I anticipate that discussion will indeed take place, Commander Thal. I want to be transparent with you, given the trust that has developed between our forces over these past hours. Humanity does not enter alliances lightly, given our history, but we take our commitment seriously once made, and the old pact between our civilizations was never something we intended to abandon, regardless of how quiet our presence within coalition affairs has remained over the past 3 centuries. I thought of the desperate message our council had sent less than a week earlier, born from fear and near total desperation, uncertain whether a species we had largely dismissed as too young and inexperienced to matter would even respond to our request for aid. I thought of my own doubts upon seeing only 42 ships arrive, certain that such a small force could offer little beyond symbolic gesture against overwhelming odds. And I thought of everything that had unfolded over the following 5 hours, a demonstration of capability so overwhelming that it had fundamentally reshaped my understanding of what humanity truly represented within the broader galactic community. "Commander Voss," I said finally, "I believe I speak not only for myself, but for the entire coalition, when I say that we are deeply grateful the old pact was never truly forgotten, despite 3 centuries of quiet distance between our civilizations. Whatever relationship develops between our peoples moving forward, I hope it reflects the same respect and honesty you have shown throughout this engagement." Voss extended his hand once more, and I clasped it firmly, recognizing in that simple gesture the beginning of something far greater than a single military engagement, however remarkable that engagement had been. "I share that hope, Commander Thal," he said quietly. "I believe our 2 civilizations have much to learn from each other in the times ahead." As Voss departed my bridge to return to his own fleet, I remained standing at the viewport, watching the quiet aftermath of a battle that would undoubtedly be remembered as one of the most significant turning points in the history of the Ash Veil conflict. Wreckage drifted silently across the debris field, the remnants of an enemy force that had once seemed unstoppable, now reduced to scattered fragments by a fleet that had arrived in response to our most desperate hour. 6 days of devastating losses, culminating in a message sent as a final, uncertain measure of desperation. 5 hours of engagement that had transformed the entire trajectory of this war, and a species that had, until this very day, remained little more than a distant footnote within coalition history, quietly waiting on the edge of galactic affairs, never revealing the true extent of what they were capable of until the exact moment they were truly needed. I thought of the old reports I had read throughout my career, dismissive assessments describing humanity as young, inexperienced, and largely irrelevant to matters of significant galactic importance. I thought of how completely those assessments had been proven wrong within the span of a single afternoon. The Coalition had spent 3 centuries underestimating a species that had simply never needed to demonstrate their true capability, content to remain a quiet, distant ally until the moment their assistance became truly essential. And now, having finally witnessed what humanity could achieve when given genuine reason to fight, I found myself both deeply grateful and quietly humbled by everything this remarkable day had revealed. As my fleet began the long process of recovery and repair, preparing to return to Coalition space alongside our new human allies, I found myself looking forward with a renewed sense of hope, tempered by a growing curiosity about exactly what other capabilities humanity might still be holding quietly in reserve. Whatever the future held for the relationship between our two civilizations, I understood with absolute certainty that everything the galaxy thought it knew about humanity had changed forever within those 5 remarkable hours. And somewhere, deep within Coalition space, word of this victory would soon spread to every world, every council chamber, every corner of civilization that had once dismissed humanity as too young and too distant to matter. The galaxy was about to learn, in ways none of us could yet fully predict, exactly what happened when humanity finally entered the battlefield.